It's a great privilege for me now to introduce our next speaker. Okay, ready for this? Plan International's National Ambassador, Non-Executive Board Director of both OzHarvest and YWCA. She has represented Australian youth at APEC and the G20. I'm still going. She was the youngest member of the Australian Financial Review 100 Women of Influence and top 40 under 40 most influential Asian Australians, and frequently appears on prominent Australian media programs to discuss the role of diversity in social change. All right. Most recently, she was awarded Young Influencer of the Year 2021 by the King Centre. She's an incredible young woman. Please welcome to the stage award-winning speaker, writer and youth advocate, Yasmin Poole.
Well, it's such an honour to speak with you all today. I have to confess, actually, I was planning on wearing colour today, but it didn't feel quite right hearing the devastating stories that have been emerging from Parliament. And before starting my speech, I'd like to quickly emphasise that I, as with all of you, stand with the survivors that have come forward and bravely shared their story about sexual assault. We stand with you, and we will stand with you every single step of the way. Well, I have to say, today is especially special to me because as a first-year university student, I actually volunteered at this event, can you imagine? So I was one of the people outside scanning your tickets and, serving and volunteering at the event. So it's a bit of a pinch-yourself moment to be able to speak to you all here today. Well, I'm a Victorian resident, so unfortunately, I spent most of last year at home. And I was speaking to somebody I was close with and asked them, what kind of hobbies did you get into during that time? And they started talking about plants and how over lockdown they'd grown all types of different plants in their home. But they mentioned something that really stuck with me, which is the idea of a root system. They talked about how with a plant, there are these roots that extend beyond the soil. They dictate how the plant will grow. And its existence is essential for the plant to survive and adapt. These roots are who these plants are. Now, in a sense, it's an analogy to how I got to where I am today. I went through high school trying to find my purpose. I knew I wanted to do good, but I couldn't pinpoint what that was. I'd always viewed feminism as an abstract concept, one that I respected, but still couldn't really understand how it connected to my own life. But that all changed in year 11. Where I saw a sign advertising a public speaking competition where we could talk about whatever we cared about. That was a pretty big question for year 11 to think about, so I sat on that. But I got my answer a few days later in maths class. I overheard my classmates talking about a Muslim ban. It was 2014, and ISIS was dominating the headlines. People I considered friends were saying how Muslims were violent and had no place in this country. That hit home because my mother is a Muslim and she'd worked hard her entire life to provide for her kids, and now she was linked to a foreign situation that she had no control over. She was somehow now treated as a danger and violent. It wasn't the first time I felt like I had to swallow my words. I grew up in rural Victoria, and my mum stood out compared to the sea of white students. I would see how she'd be treated differently. People would speak to her slowly and assume she couldn't speak English, or classmates would laugh when she wore traditional wear. So when I heard this comment about a Muslim ban, it was the final straw. I knew I had to say something. So a couple of weeks later, I was standing in a room, hands shaking, my crumpled public speaking speech in my pocket. And I spoke about what it feels like to be her daughter. As I spoke, I noticed a young man in the audience. He was sitting next to his mother, who was also wearing a hijab. We locked eyes. He understood. In that moment, I reached down into my roots and found a source of strength. I suddenly made the connection of feminism with my own life, understanding how my mum's experience was an interlocking web of racism and sexism. But through my roots, I joined the conversation. It ignited a flame. When I extended my hand, I realized how my story connected to the story of so many others. There's a quote by the feminist Audre Lorde who says, "The woman's place of power within each of us is neither white nor surface. It is dark, it is ancient, and it is deep." Through my work, I've been fortunate to speak to hundreds of women, and time again, I'm reminded of the power of tapping into your roots. Women who, despite the odds, chose to challenge. I spoke with Akka from Kiribati. She had an educated father, but her mother was illiterate and spoke little English. Despite this, her childhood memories were filled with her mother helping her and her brothers with their homework every single night, practicing times tables and ensuring they were prepared. Akka now works in the World Bank in international development. I spoke to Esther from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Her mother escaped a civil war that killed millions. Rebel soldiers were raping women attempting to flee. Whilst pregnant in the camp, Esther's mum built her house out of mud and hay, and her mum and other single mothers endured misogyny and discrimination for having deceased husbands. Esther is now in Australia and runs her own refugee advocacy organisation. She's also in Year 11. And my mother sold food on the side of the street in Singapore. And now here I am, speaking to all of you. The fight for gender equality can feel lonely. 99.5 years to go until we reach gender equality is overwhelming. But you are never alone. We stand here today with the roots of our stories below us, the women who have come before us. That fight burns inside of us because we don't need permission to speak up. Change will never be handed to us. If we want to achieve gender equality, we must embrace our lived experience because it isn't an abstract concept. It's women's lives. It's our lives. But just like our own stories, our institutions have deep roots in the soil of our history, and it tells a more sinister tale. In the example of women's stories that I mentioned, I can't help but reflect on how it also demonstrates how governments have silenced women's voices. Akka's illiterate mother demonstrated how education was not gender equal, and the education of women was not prioritised. Esther's mother had to face uniquely gendered violence as a refugee, which so often isn't discussed. My mother's experience of discrimination started with people's feeling of difference, magnified and politicised by those in power who relied on dog whistling to gain political clout. Women of colour were largely not represented in our leadership and not able to control their narrative. The reality is our higher political institutions continue to push women to the side. I remember on my 21st birthday, I was speaking to Parliament of Victoria to a leadership program of young women of colour. I looked at the walls and I noticed that every single portrait was of an old white man. And it couldn't contrast more with the diverse faces of young women I saw sitting in front of me, bold and hoping to create change, both inside and outside of their communities. Looking at our history, women were forcefully excluded from the ability to shape Australia's story. Effectively, no women were represented in the writing of Australia's Constitution, Australia's most important document. There was one brave woman that stood for Parliament back then in South Australia, but she was dismissed because, and I quote, "Women, lunatics, and children did not have the legal right to run." Women were eventually granted the right to vote, but even then, this wasn't equal. Indigenous women gained the right 60 years later than other Australian women, and women of colour were essentially excluded from Australia until the White Australia policy was abolished in the 1970s. In Australia, we have come a long way, but the roots of sexism run deep. Just look at the COVID-19 crisis, when Australia's political leaders had the audacity to say, "We're all in this together." But Australian women still perform almost double the amount of unpaid work compared to men, more likely to stop working to have to care for their family. 10% of Australian women experienced gender-based violence in the first few months of the pandemic. 10%. And our federal COVID-19 response didn't have a woman in sight. On an international level, it produced even more devastating outcomes, with over 2 million girls pulled out of school. These outcomes are shocking, but you wouldn't think it with the response from our leaders. I remember when I was on Q&A last year and we were talking about the impact of COVID on women, and one of the politicians said, "Well, maybe we'll know in hindsight how women are treated." And I was appalled, because women's simple demand for equality was once again swept to the side. Those in power were willfully allowing the gender gap to grow. Women were not given the pen to control our narrative. And despite representing over half of the population, we were merely a footnote in a wider conversation. So how do we move forward and cut down the roots of gender inequality? We're all part of a wider tree. We're made up of our family and linked together as women. But our roots are also tied to our institutions and their difficult history. We cannot look away. It's a reality that we must confront. So first, before we choose to challenge the world, we need to challenge ourselves. We fight for gender equality, but we do not all have the same universal experience of discrimination. Diverse women, like women of colour, experience unique forms of discrimination, a web of issues like racism and sexism. So take the time to question our inner monologue, our assumptions about what leadership looks like, to actively get used to scanning the room for diversity, to check in with ourselves and ask, how much space do I take up? Who am I speaking over? How much power do I have compared to others? And who do I need to learn from? It is not enough to cut off leaves of inequality. We must seek to address it at its root. We have privilege to be in this room today. Let's challenge ourselves by supporting and amplifying the voices of the most marginalised women, from Indigenous women in Black Lives Matter to the low-income mothers that struggled during COVID-19. Our freedom is intertwined with each other. We must start with the radical act of taking women seriously, believing that what women say about themselves and their experience is important and valid, even when it has little or no relationship to our lives. Second, we must choose to challenge each other, to not underestimate the power of language, to not shy away from the word feminism, to call out sexism and racism and identify them as such. Because for all of us to succeed, we cannot be strategically silent. Finally, we must choose to challenge our institutions. While Australia has come a long way, our women are not yet safe. Amidst the horrifying reports of rape in Parliament, the allegations of sexual assault by a former High Court Justice, the highest legal institution in the land, gender inequality remains embedded in the walls of our highest decision-makers, who have continued to rely on women's silence and their feeling of being untouchable. But like Icarus, you fly too close to the sun and you will get burned. Women, all of us, need to talk about our lives as if it matters, because it does. We need to control our narrative and demand enough is enough. We cannot turn away from these problems because they remain today and are issues young women like me will inherit. Don't wait for permission to stand up. Don't wait for permission to demand better. Draw upon the strength of the women in our own lives, because that power is already inside of us. Unlike what our decision makers say, it is never too urgent to ignore gender equality, because it's never too urgent to ignore women's lives. So today, I don't ask you to look to the sky to imagine a better future. Look to the ground. It is up to us to chip away at the roots of gender inequality, one by one. Let us grow together, creating a forest of freedom for all.